There is a precise moment in the architecture of human consciousness, when the fortress you have spent your entire life building becomes your prison, when the voice that once guided you turns venomous, when the mind that once protected you becomes your most ruthless adversary. This is not madness. This is awakening. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing in a room you've known your entire life. The walls are familiar. The furniture speaks of memory. Every object tells a story of who you are. Now imagine that room beginning to shift. The walls pulse with a heartbeat that isn't yours. The mirrors reflect faces you don't recognize. The voice calling your name comes from everywhere and nowhere, and it sounds like you. But it speaks words that tear at the foundations of everything you believed about yourself. This is the experience we rarely speak about, the psychological event that philosophers have called the dark night of the soul, that mystics have termed ego death, and that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand as a fundamental reorganization of the self-concept. This is what happens when the inner world turns against you. Tonight, we descend into that forbidden territory. We walk through the landscape where self meets shadow, where consciousness encounters its own contradictions, where the constructed identity begins to collapse under the weight of its own fabrications. And in that collapse, in that terrifying disintegration, we discover something that psychology, philosophy, and ancient wisdom have been pointing toward for millennia. The death of who you think you are is the birth of what you actually are. But first, we must understand the nature of this inner war. We must trace its origins, comprehend its mechanisms, and recognize why this experience, this psychological crucifixion, might be the most important thing that ever happens to a human being. Consider this. You are not one person. You never have been. Inside your skull, behind your eyes, beneath the singular I that claims ownership of your thoughts, there exists a parliament of selves, subpersonalities, neural networks competing for dominance, evolutionary programs running simultaneously. The part of you that wants security wages war against the part that craves freedom. The version of you that seeks belonging conflicts with the aspect that demands authenticity. The identity you present to the world sits in constant tension with the shadow you hide even from yourself. For most of your life, you've maintained a fragile peace treaty between these competing forces. You've constructed what psychologists call a coherent self-narrative, a story about who you are that makes sense, that feels stable, that allows you to move through the world without falling apart. You've built an ego structure, a psychological fortress that protects you from the chaos of raw experience and the terror of infinite possibility. But what happens when that structure begins to crack? What happens when the internal voices that once whispered now scream? What happens when the shadow parts you've repressed for decades rise up and demand recognition? What happens when your own mind becomes a battlefield and you cannot tell which side you're supposed to be on? This is the phenomenon we're exploring tonight, not the gentle spiritual awakening promised in self-help books, not the comfortable personal growth taught in weekend workshops. No, we're examining the real thing, the brutal thing, the kind of psychological transformation that feels like dying because, in every way that matters, it is. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." He understood what we're about to explore, that the journey inward is not a peaceful meditation retreat, but a descent into personal hell. That awakening doesn't feel like enlightenment, it feels like disintegration. In the ancient texts of various wisdom traditions, there are stories of initiates who must die before they can be reborn. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the soul encounters terrifying visions that are actually projections of its own mind. In Christian mysticism, the dark night of the soul represents a period where God seems absent, where all previous certainties dissolve. In shamanic traditions, the healer must be torn apart by spirits before they can heal others. These aren't metaphors, They're accurate descriptions of a psychological process that, when it occurs, feels utterly literal. Modern psychology has given us new language for this ancient experience. We call it ego death, depersonalization, existential crisis, psychological breakdown, identity dissolution. Neuroscience shows us that the brain regions responsible for maintaining a coherent sense of self can temporarily go offline, creating the sensation of self-annihilation. Psychiatry has documented the phenomenon in everything from severe depression to spiritual emergencies, from psychedelic experiences to meditation-induced crises. But here's what makes this experience so dangerous and so sacred. When your inner world turns against you, you cannot run, you cannot escape, because the enemy is you, the battlefield is you. The weapons are forged from your own memories, fears, and denied truths. And the war cannot end until one version of you dies, so that a truer version can emerge. Tonight we're going to understand why this happens. We'll trace the architecture of the self and discover how it's designed to eventually self-destruct. We'll explore the triggers that catalyze this inner collapse: trauma, loss, exhaustion, spiritual practice, psychedelics, or simply the accumulated weight of living a life that isn't authentically yours. We'll examine what happens in the brain when the ego structure begins to dismantle. And most importantly, we'll discover why this process, as terrifying as it is, might be evolution's most sophisticated technology for transforming consciousness. But I need to warn you, what we're about to explore is not comfortable. If you're listening to this while doing something else, stop. Give this your full attention, because we're about to enter territory that might feel uncomfortably familiar. You might recognize yourself in these descriptions. You might realize you're in the middle of this process right now, or that you've survived it already, or that you're terrified it might happen to you. That fear is appropriate. This is real. This is dangerous. And it's also potentially the most important psychological event in a human life. So take a breath. Settle into your seat. We're about to journey into the place where consciousness turns on itself, where the mind becomes both predator and prey, where the self you thought was solid reveals itself to be smoke and mirrors. We're going to explore what happens when the inner world stops protecting you and starts hunting you. And in that exploration, we might discover something remarkable, that the voice condemning you from within is actually trying to free you, that the psychological collapse you're experiencing isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough, that when your inner world turns against the false self you've constructed, it's actually fighting for the true self you've buried. This is the story of the most important war you'll ever fight, the war with yourself, the war that ends not with victory, but with surrender, not with conquest, but with transformation, not with one side winning, but with both sides dissolving into something entirely new. The question we'll be asking tonight is not, how do we stop this from happening, but rather, how do we survive it? How do we allow it to complete? And who are we when it's over? Because when the inner world turns against you, it's not trying to destroy you. It's trying to destroy everything that isn't truly you. And that distinction between the authentic self and the false self is written in fire and blood across the landscape of human consciousness. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's understand how we create the self that must eventually be destroyed. Let's trace the origins of the inner war. In the beginning, there was no self. There was only sensation, only awareness, only the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive. And then, something happened. Something that would change the trajectory of human consciousness forever. The child learned to say, I. Around the age of 2, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, something shifts in the developing brain. The prefrontal cortex begins to mature. Language starts to wire into the neural architecture. And suddenly, astonishingly, the child becomes capable of self-reference, of standing outside their experience and observing it, of creating distance between the experiencer and the experienced. I want. I need. I am. These simple statements represent one of the most complex evolutionary achievements in the history of consciousness. the capacity for self-reflection, the ability to construct a narrative about oneself, the power to imagine oneself as a continuous entity moving through time. But here's what developmental psychology reveals. The self that emerges in childhood is not a discovery, it's a construction, a magnificent, necessary, and ultimately fictional construction. The infant does not distinguish between self and world. When the mother leaves the room, she doesn't merely go away. From the infant's perspective, she ceases to exist. There is no object permanence, no continuity, no separate self observing a separate world. There is only experience happening. But as the brain develops, as language emerges, as the social world makes its demands, the child begins to construct what psychologists call the self-concept, a story about who they are, a collection of beliefs, memories, and predictions that create the illusion of a continuous, stable identity. This construction is essential. Without it, we couldn't function. We couldn't plan for the future, learn from the past, or navigate the complex social world of human relationships. The self-concept is evolution's solution to the problem of consciousness, how to turn the raw chaos of experience into something manageable, predictable, and functional. But here's the trap. We forget that it's a construction. We mistake the map for the territory. We believe that the story we're telling about ourselves is who we actually are. And in that forgetting, we plant the seeds of our own inner war. Let me take you back to a specific moment in psychological history, Vienna, 1895. A neurologist named Sigmund Freud is working with patients suffering from what he calls hysteria, symptoms with no apparent physical cause. Through years of careful observation, Freud begins to construct a revolutionary model of the mind. He proposes that consciousness is not a unified whole but a battleground of competing forces. The ID, primal, instinctual, demanding immediate gratification. The superego, internalized rules and prohibitions, the voice of society and morality judging every impulse. And caught between them, the ego, the conscious self, trying desperately to negotiate between desire and constraint, between what we want and what we're allowed to want. Freud called this intrapsychic conflict, and he understood something profound. The self is not peaceful, it's not integrated, it's at war with itself from the very beginning. The child wants to scream in the grocery store. Society says no. The adolescent feels desires that religion condemns. The adult longs for freedom while clinging to security. Every moment of consciousness involves managing these conflicts, repressing some impulses, sublimating others, compromising between competing needs. And most of the time we maintain what Freud called ego defenses, psychological strategies that help us navigate internal conflict without falling apart. We rationalize, we deny, we project our unacceptable qualities onto others. We compartmentalize, keeping contradictory beliefs separate so they never have to face each other. But what happens when these defenses fail? What happens when the repressed material becomes too powerful to contain? Freud observed that his patients would often experience what he called the return of the repressed, buried memories, denied desires, shadow aspects of the self exploding into consciousness with such force that they overwhelmed the ego's capacity to manage them. This was the beginning of understanding the inner war, but it was only the beginning. Jump forward 30 years. Switzerland, 1925. Carl Jung, once Freud's protege and now his intellectual rival, is developing a radically different model of the psyche. Jung has gone deeper than Freud, further into the underground of consciousness, and what he's discovered there both fascinates and terrifies him. Jung proposes that beneath the personal unconscious described by Freud lies something even more profound, the collective unconscious. A layer of the psyche inherited from our evolutionary history, populated by what he calls archetypes, universal patterns of being human that transcend individual experience. The hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. These aren't just symbols in myths and fairy tales. According to Jung, They're living forces within the psyche, autonomous complexes that can possess consciousness, speak through dreams, and wage war for control of the personality. Jung understood something that Freud missed. The self isn't just in conflict between desire and prohibition. It's in conflict between multiple archetypal energies, each with its own agenda, its own wisdom, its own demands for expression. The part of you that wants to be a hero conflicts with the part that wants to be safe. The inner nurturer battles the inner critic. The spiritual seeker fights with the pragmatic survivor. And at the center of this conflict sits what Jung called the ego, not the entire self, but merely the conscious tip of a vast unconscious iceberg. The ego believes it's in charge. It believes it's running the show. But Jung knew better. The ego is more like a rider on an elephant, imagining it controls an animal far more powerful than itself. Jung described the process he called individuation, the lifelong journey towards psychological wholeness. But here's what makes his model so relevant to our topic tonight. Jung understood that individuation doesn't happen through gentle growth. It happens through crisis, through what he called enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite, that whatever we most identify with will eventually confront us in its shadow form. If you build your identity around being strong, you will eventually encounter your profound weakness. If you define yourself as good, you will face your capacity for evil. If you see yourself as rational, you will be overwhelmed by irrationality. Whatever you deny in yourself will grow in the dark until it becomes powerful enough to destroy the one-sided conscious attitude that excluded it. This is why the inner world turns against you. Not because you're broken or failing, but because the psyche demands wholeness. The parts of yourself you've disowned, denied, or repressed don't disappear. They form what Jung called the shadow, everything you refuse to recognize in yourself. And the shadow grows stronger in exile, waiting for the moment when your conscious defenses weaken enough for it to break through. Jung himself experienced this process in what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological crisis lasting several years, where he felt himself fragmenting, dissolving, encountering forces within his own psyche that seemed utterly alien and terrifying. He documented this experience in what would later be published as the Red Book, a record of his descent into his own inner hell and his eventual return, transformed. He wrote, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious, and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work." Do you hear what he's saying? The psychological collapse, the period when his inner world seemed to attack him, was not a pathological episode to be overcome. It was the essential experience that gave birth to his life's work. The breakdown was the breakthrough. But let's go even deeper. Let's examine the actual architecture of the self and understand why it's designed to eventually crack under its own weight. Modern neuroscience has given us extraordinary tools for understanding consciousness. Brain imaging technology allows us to watch the self-concept being constructed in real time. And what we've discovered is both beautiful and unsettling. There's a network of brain regions that neuroscientists call the default mode network, areas that activate when you're not focused on the external world, when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, or simply being you. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the parietal lobes. Together, these regions create what we experience as the continuous self, the I that seems to exist across time. But here's the fascinating part. This network can be temporarily disrupted. Studies of meditation masters show decreased activity in the default mode network during deep practice. Research on psychedelics reveals that substances like psilocybin temporarily disrupt the connectivity of this network, leading to experiences of ego dissolution and unity with the universe. Even extreme stress or trauma can cause this network to go offline, creating dissociative states where the sense of self fragments or disappears entirely. What this tells us is profound. The self is not a thing. It's a process, an ongoing construction created by specific neural activity, and like any construction, it can be deconstructed. Neuroscientist Anil Seth describes consciousness as a controlled hallucination, the brain's best guess about reality, constantly updated by sensory input, but never actually experiencing reality directly. And if consciousness itself is a controlled hallucination, then the self is a hallucination within a hallucination, a story the brain tells about itself to create coherence and continuity. This isn't to say the self is meaningless or unnecessary. It's to understand that it's fundamentally a fiction, a useful, essential, but ultimately constructed fiction. And when you build an identity on fiction, eventually the truth wants out. Think about the process of how we construct identity throughout life. The child internalizes messages from parents. You're so smart. Why can't you be more like your sister? Good girls don't get angry. Each message becomes a building block in the self-concept. I am smart. I am inadequate. I must not show anger. The adolescent tries on different identities like clothes, searching for one that fits the feedback from peers, from culture, from the mirror. Am I attractive? Popular? Cool? Weird? The identity that gets reinforced becomes the one we inhabit. The adult constructs elaborate stories about who they are based on career, relationships, achievements, failures. I am a successful lawyer. I am a devoted parent. I am someone who has overcome adversity. We curate our social media presence, our resume, our self-presentation to align with the story we're telling. But here's the problem. Life doesn't care about your story. Reality has no obligation to support your self-concept. And eventually, through loss, through failure, through exhaustion, through simply living long enough, the gap between who you've decided you are and what life is actually asking of you becomes unbearable. This is the moment when the inner world begins to turn against you. When the voice that once said, "You can do this," starts saying, "Who were you kidding?" When the identity that once felt solid starts feeling like a costume you can't take off. When the beliefs that once organized your reality start revealing themselves as the prison bars they've always been. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood this process, perhaps better than anyone. He wrote about what he called the transvaluation of all values, the moment when everything you believed about good and evil, right and wrong, success and failure gets inverted. When your moral framework, your entire system of meaning, collapses. Nietzsche himself experienced profound psychological suffering throughout his life, culminating in a complete mental breakdown from which he never recovered. But before that collapse, he wrote some of the most penetrating psychological insights in Western philosophy. He understood that we build our values, our beliefs, our entire worldview, not from truth, but from need, from fear, from the desperate desire to make life bearable. He called this life-denying philosophy, the tendency to create moral systems that condemn and suppress our actual nature in service of some imagined ideal. And he saw that when these systems eventually fail, when the gap between the ideal and the real becomes too obvious to deny, the result is what he called nihilism, the terrifying recognition that there is no inherent meaning, no absolute values, no solid ground beneath our feet. But Nietzsche also saw that this collapse could be the beginning of something new, that the destruction of false values could create space for what he called life-affirming philosophy, an embrace of existence as it actually is, with all its chaos, contradiction, and creative potential. The death of God, the collapse of absolute meaning, could give birth to what he called the Übermensch, not a superior human being, but a transformed one who has passed through nihilism and emerged capable of creating their own values, their own meaning, their own authentic existence. This is the pattern we're beginning to see. Throughout history, across disciplines, thinkers have recognized that human consciousness contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction and transformation, that the self we construct must eventually be demolished, that the inner world will eventually turn against the false structures we've built and demand something truer, something more real. But why? Why would evolution design consciousness this way? Why would the psyche contain this self-destructive or self-transforming mechanism? The answer might lie in understanding that consciousness itself is still evolving, that we're not the finished product but a transitional species caught between the animal we were and something we're becoming. That the capacity for self-reflection, for turning consciousness back on itself, creates not just the possibility, but the inevitability of psychological crisis. When consciousness becomes capable of observing itself, it inevitably discovers the gap between what it is and what it thinks it is, between the raw process of being alive and the stories we tell about that process. And in that gap, crisis is born. This is the prison we've been building since we learned to say I. This is the architecture of the self, intricate, necessary, functional, and ultimately designed to collapse under its own weight. Because the prison walls that once protected us eventually become the barriers that prevent our growth. And when those walls start to crack, when the structure starts to fail, when the inner world begins its revolution against the tyrant of the false self, that's when the real descent begins. The collapse doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a warning. It begins quietly, subtly, like a hairline fracture in the foundation of a building. You don't notice it at first. Life continues. You go through the motions. But somewhere deep in the architecture of your psyche, something has shifted. Maybe it starts with dreams, strange dreams, disturbing dreams, dreams where you're being chased by something you can't see, or falling through spaces that shouldn't exist, or watching yourself from outside your body, or encountering versions of yourself you don't recognize. Jung would tell you these are messages from the unconscious, warning signs that the ego structure is under siege. Or maybe it begins with a thought that arrives unbidden, that you can't dismiss, that keeps returning despite your best efforts to suppress it. This isn't my life. I don't know who I am anymore. None of this means what I thought it meant. Or perhaps it starts with a feeling, a background hum of wrongness that colors everything. Nothing has changed in your external circumstances, but internally, something feels off. The activities that used to bring satisfaction now feel hollow. The relationships that once felt stable now seem performative. The identity you've inhabited feels like a suit that no longer fits. This is how it begins. Not with a dramatic crisis, but with a slow erosion of certainty. What psychiatry might call existential anxiety or depersonalization. What spiritual traditions call the dark night of the soul. What happens when the constructed self begins to sense its own constructedness? Let me tell you a story. Not my story, because this isn't about any one person, but a composite story drawn from thousands of recorded cases, from clinical reports, from spiritual literature, from the hidden testimonies of those who've passed through this fire. There was a person, let's call them Alex, though the gender doesn't matter, the name doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern. Alex had built a successful life, good career, stable relationships, respectable identity, all the markers that society uses to denote a functioning adult. Alex had done everything right. And then something happened. Maybe it was a death, the loss of someone close that shattered the illusion of permanence. Maybe it was a betrayal, discovering that a foundational relationship was built on lies. Maybe it was a failure, an ambition pursued for decades that ended in collapse. Maybe it was simply exhaustion, the accumulated weight of living a life that required constant performance, constant maintenance of the self-image. Whatever the trigger, something broke. And in that breaking, the inner voices changed their tone. The inner critic, which had always been there but manageable, suddenly became vicious. Every thought was scrutinized and found wanting. Every action was judged and condemned. You're not good enough. You've never been good enough. Everyone knows it. You're a fraud, an imposter. It's only a matter of time before everyone sees what you really are. Nothing. The anxious voice, which had provided useful caution, became paralytic terror. Something terrible is about to happen. You're going to lose everything. You're not safe. Nowhere is safe. Your body is betraying you. Your mind is betraying you. You're coming apart. The perfectionist voice, which had driven achievement, became an impossible taskmaster. Nothing you do is acceptable. Every tiny flaw is evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. You must try harder, work longer, never rest, never stop, and still, it will never be enough. And beneath all these voices, a new one emerged. Or perhaps it had always been there, just too quiet to hear. A voice that whispered the most terrifying thing of all. You don't exist? Not really. Everything you think you are is a story you're telling yourself, and the story is falling apart. Soon, there will be nothing left but the void. This is what it feels like when the inner world turns against you. It's not metaphorical. It's not poetic exaggeration. For those in the midst of this experience, it's viscerally, terrifyingly real. The mind becomes an enemy. Consciousness becomes a torture chamber. Every waking moment is a battle against voices that seem to emanate from your own psyche, but feel utterly alien and hostile. Psychologists have documented this phenomenon across various contexts. In severe depression, patients report that their own thoughts become weapons used against them. In PTSD, the mind replays traumatic events on an endless loop, forcing the person to re-experience horror against their will. In what's called spiritual emergency, a term coined by psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, individuals undergoing rapid spiritual development can experience psychological symptoms that look identical to psychosis: hearing voices, losing sense of self, feeling invaded by foreign entities. But here's what makes this so complex. Sometimes these aren't pathological symptoms requiring medication and suppression. Sometimes they're healthy processes requiring support and completion. The challenge is knowing the difference. And in our culture, which pathologizes all psychological distress, we often medicate away the very experiences that could lead to transformation. Let me be clear. I'm not romanticizing mental illness. Clinical depression is real. Psychosis is real. Trauma disorders are real. And they require real treatment. But there's another category of experience, what Grof and his wife Christina called spiritual emergence, where psychological crisis is actually the psyche's attempt to heal itself, to restructure itself, to break through to a new level of integration. The problem is that from the outside, and often from the inside, these two phenomena can look identical. The person experiencing either one is in genuine distress. They're not functioning normally. Their grip on consensus reality is loosening. They're reporting experiences that sound delusional. How do we know whether to intervene and suppress or support and allow? The philosopher and psychologist William James explored this question in his groundbreaking work, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James documented case after case of individuals who went through periods of extreme psychological suffering, what he called the sick soul, before experiencing profound spiritual awakening. He noted that many of history's great religious figures, mystics, and visionaries went through periods of madness before their revelations. James distinguished between what he called healthy-minded religion, optimistic, life-affirming, focused on goodness and light, and the religion of the sick soul, forged in darkness, acquainted with evil and suffering, familiar with despair. And he argued that the latter, though more painful, often led to deeper and more authentic spiritual insight. Why? Because it forced a confrontation with what he called the iron contradiction at the heart of existence. The recognition that life contains both ecstasy and suffering, meaning and meaninglessness, that we are simultaneously insignificant specks in an indifferent universe, and the very consciousness through which the universe comes to know itself. This confrontation, this direct encounter with contradiction, is unbearable to the ego structure. The ego demands consistency, coherence, a story that makes sense. When reality refuses to cooperate, when the contradictions become impossible to reconcile, the ego structure begins to fragment. And this is where the experience becomes truly hellish. Because as the ego structure cracks, the person experiences what psychiatry calls dissociation, a disconnection from the sense of self, from the body, from reality itself. They might look in the mirror and not recognize their own face. They might hear themselves speaking and feel like the words are coming from someone else. They might watch their own hands moving and feel no connection to the action. This is depersonalization, the sense of being unreal, of being a character in a movie, of watching your life from behind glass. And its counterpart, derealization, the sense that the external world is unreal, flat, lifeless, like a stage set with nothing behind the props. These experiences are terrifying precisely because they undermine the most basic assumption we have, that we exist, that we are real, that there is a solid I at the center of experience. When that assumption dissolves, even for a moment, it creates existential panic unlike anything else a human can experience. But here's what's happening underneath the terror. The default mode network, the neural system that creates the sense of a continuous self, is malfunctioning. Or looked at differently, it's being recalibrated. The boundaries that normally separate self from other, past from present, internal from external, are becoming permeable. In a famous meditation study conducted by neuroscientist Judson Brewer, advanced meditators showed the ability to voluntarily reduce activity in the default mode network. When they did, they reported experiences of non-dual awareness, consciousness without a separate observer. No self, no subject-object split. Just experience, happening. And they described it as profoundly peaceful. But when this same dissolution happens involuntarily, when the person isn't prepared for it, hasn't chosen it, doesn't have a framework for understanding it, it's experienced not as peace but as annihilation, not as enlightenment but as insanity. This is the cruel paradox, the experience that mystics seek through decades of practice, that spiritual teachers describe as the ultimate liberation, feels like death when it happens spontaneously to someone who doesn't expect it or understand it. And so the person suffering through ego death does everything they can to stop it. They grip tighter to their identity. They amplify their psychological defenses. They try desperately to reconstruct the sense of self that's dissolving. And this resistance, this desperate clinging, creates a feedback loop that makes the suffering worse. It's like drowning. The natural response when you can't breathe is to panic, to thrash, to fight against the water. But that panic uses oxygen faster and makes drowning happen quicker. The counterintuitive truth is that the way to survive is to relax, to let the body float, to stop fighting. But every instinct screams against it. The same is true in psychological crisis. The way through is surrender. But surrender feels like dying, and so the person fights, and the fighting creates more suffering, and the suffering reinforces the sense that something terrible is happening, and the cycle intensifies. Carl Jung called this process the sacrifice of the ego. He understood that true transformation requires the ego to willingly step down from its position as the center of consciousness, to recognize itself as one voice among many, not the sovereign ruler of the psyche. But the ego, by its very nature, resists this demotion. It fights for survival, and in fighting, it creates the very crisis it's trying to avoid. Let's go deeper into the phenomenology, the lived experience of this inner war. Because understanding the mechanics is different from understanding what it actually feels like. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the voice in your head, the one you've always thought of as you, has split into multiple voices. One voice is saying, "Get up, you have responsibilities." Another is saying, "What's the point? Nothing matters." Another is observing both voices and commenting, "You're losing it. You're going insane." And beneath them all, a void of silence that feels more like you than any of the voices, but that terrifies you Because if that silence is you, then who have you been all this time? Now imagine that this experience doesn't last a few minutes but weeks, months, that you can't escape it by distraction or sleep, that every waking moment is spent in this psychological chamber of mirrors, unable to find the real you among the reflections. Imagine that your memories start feeling foreign. You look back at your life and can't connect to the person who lived those experiences. Was that really me? Did those events actually happen? Your entire history feels like a story someone told you about someone else. The continuity that defines identity, the sense that the person you were at age 7 and the person you are now are the same being, dissolves. Imagine that your emotions become incomprehensible. You're grieving, but you don't know what you're grieving. You're angry, but there's no object for the anger. It's just pure rage with nowhere to direct it. You're afraid, constantly. But of what? There's no external threat. The threat is coming from inside, from your own consciousness. This is what psychological warfare looks like when the enemy is yourself. And the most terrifying part? There's nowhere to run. You can't escape your own mind. You carry the battlefield with you everywhere you go. Some people in this state become suicidal, not because they want to die, they're actually desperate to live, but because it seems like the only way to make the psychological suffering stop. The self is in so much pain that the only solution appears to be the elimination of the self. The ultimate tragic irony, the entity trying to escape suffering by ending its existence, is the same entity whose suffering would end if it could stop trying to exist in the form it's clinging to. Others turn to addictive behaviors, substances, work, sex, food, digital media, anything that provides temporary relief from the intensity of their inner experience. They're not seeking pleasure, they're seeking oblivion. A few hours of not feeling, not thinking, not being themselves. But the relief is temporary, and when it wears off, the inner conflict returns with increased intensity. Still others retreat from the world entirely. Social isolation, inability to work, days or weeks spent in bed, not from laziness, but from the sheer exhaustion of managing the psychological civil war. Every social interaction requires maintaining the performance of being a coherent person when internally you feel like scattered fragments. Eventually, the energy required becomes unsustainable. Traditional psychiatry looks at these symptoms and sees pathology requiring correction. The dominant model of mental health is homeostatic. It assumes there's a normal, healthy state of psychological functioning, and that departure from this state represents illness. Treatment aims to return the person to baseline. Medication suppresses symptoms. Therapy teaches coping strategies. And sometimes this is exactly what's needed. Sometimes the crisis is purely biological, a chemical imbalance, a neurological dysfunction, and medical intervention is appropriate and life-saving. But other times, something different is happening. The psyche is not malfunctioning, it's transforming. The old structure is being demolished not randomly but purposefully, making space for something new. The symptoms that look like breakdown are actually breakthrough attempting to happen. How do we know the difference? There are no clear diagnostic criteria, no blood test, no brain scan that can definitively distinguish pathological crisis from transformative crisis. But there are hints. In pathological crisis, there's usually pure deterioration over time. Functioning gets progressively worse. The person becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. Thought becomes more disordered. Behavior becomes more dangerous. In transformative crisis, there's often a chaotic fluctuation. Periods of intense distress alternate with moments of clarity or insight. The person might report that even though they're suffering, something feels important about what's happening. That they're not just losing themselves but discovering something true underneath the false self they've been living. Stanislav Grof, who worked with thousands of people in non-ordinary states of consciousness, developed criteria for distinguishing spiritual emergence from spiritual emergency. Key factors included the presence of spiritual or philosophical insights even in the midst of distress, eventual integration and improved functioning after the crisis, and the sense, however tenuous, that the experience has meaning and purpose beyond mere pathology. But here's the critical point. Even in transformative crisis, the person needs support. The experience is still real suffering, still genuine risk. The old romantic notion that enlightenment comes through isolated struggle is not just wrong, it's dangerous. People die in these states. They commit suicide. They become permanently psychotic. The difference between a transformative crisis that leads to growth and one that leads to tragedy often comes down to whether the person has adequate support, proper framework for understanding what's happening, and patience to let the process complete. This is where our culture fails catastrophically. We have no cultural container for psychological transformation, no rites of passage for ego death, no community support for those whose identities are dissolving. We pathologize what traditional cultures would have recognized as initiation. We medicate what indigenous shamans would have seen as a shamanic calling. We hospitalize people who might, in another context, be guided through a death rebirth experience and emerge as healers. I'm not advocating for a return to pre-modern worldviews. Modern medicine has alleviated tremendous suffering. Psychiatric intervention saves lives. But we've lost something essential in our rush to eliminate all psychological distress. The wisdom that some suffering is necessary for transformation. That death, even psychological death, can be birth. The spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle describes his own experience of ego death as a kind of internal suicide. He was in the depths of depression, contemplating actual suicide, when he noticed the thought, "I cannot live with myself any longer." And suddenly something shifted. He realized, if there is an I that cannot live with myself, then there must be two entities, the I doing the thinking and the myself that's being thought about. Which one is real? In that moment of recognition, his entire sense of self dissolved. He described it as a collapse into an inner void, followed by a state of profound peace. When he emerged hours or days later, he no longer identified with the voice in his head. He experienced himself as the awareness within which thoughts arise and pass, not as the thoughts themselves. The entity that had been in such unbearable pain, the constructed ego identity, had died, and something else remained. But Tolle was lucky. Or perhaps what made him lucky was that he spontaneously stumbled into surrender rather than resistance. He stopped fighting, stopped clinging, let the false self die, and in that space discovered he was still present, just no longer identified with the psychological construct that had been causing the suffering. Most people in this state don't stumble into surrender, they fight, and fighting makes the descent longer, deeper, more painful. The inner war intensifies, the voices become more vicious, the sense of fragmentation becomes more severe, until something gives. Sometimes what gives is the ego structure itself. It finally collapses completely, leading to either breakthrough or breakdown, transformation or hospitalization, depending on context and support. Sometimes what gives is the body. The sustained stress manifests as physical illness, autoimmune disorders, chronic pain, mysterious symptoms that no test can explain, the body keeping score of a psychological war that consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes what gives is the life structure. Relationships fall apart, jobs are lost. The entire external life collapses, forcing a confrontation with the self that can no longer be avoided through distraction. And sometimes, this is the darkest possibility, what gives is life itself. The person decides the suffering is unbearable and permanent, and they choose to end it. This is not a theoretical concern. Suicide is a genuine risk in these states, and it represents the ultimate tragic misunderstanding, believing that the death of the ego requires the death of the organism, confusing the constructed identity with life itself. The person who kills themselves to escape psychological suffering is killing the wrong thing. But how could they know that? In the midst of the collapse, when every fiber of your being feels like it's dying, when your very existence seems to be under threat, how could you know that what's dying is not you but only an idea of you? That consciousness itself will survive the death of the self-concept? that you'll still be here when the dust settles, just different, transformed, freed from the prison you've been living in. This is the cruelty of the inner war. The person suffering through it needs to hear, let it happen. Stop fighting. The death you're experiencing is necessary. You will survive it. But those are the exact words they cannot trust when they're in the midst of terror. So they hold on. They grip tighter. They fortify the walls of a fortress that's already crumbling. And the pain intensifies, and the voices grow louder, and the inner world continues its relentless assault on everything they thought they knew about themselves, until finally, inevitably, something breaks. The resistance becomes unsustainable. The old structure can no longer hold. And in that moment of ultimate vulnerability, of complete psychological nakedness, something remarkable happens. The war doesn't end with one side winning. It ends with both sides dissolving into something new. There is a moment, impossible to predict, impossible to force, when the fighting stops. Not because you've won, not because you've lost, but because suddenly, inexplicably, you stop caring about the outcome. It's not acceptance exactly. It's not understanding. It's more like exhaustion so complete that resistance becomes impossible. The psychological muscles that have been clenched in terror finally, mercifully, release. You stop trying to control the uncontrollable. Stop trying to save what cannot be saved. Stop trying to be someone. And in that moment of absolute surrender, you discover something that will change everything. You're still here. The thoughts are still happening. The sensations are still occurring. Awareness is still present. But the entity that was fighting, that believed it had to maintain itself, defend itself, prove itself, that entity has dissolved. And what remains is simpler, quieter, more fundamental than anything you've experienced as self. You are the space in which experience happens. Not the content of experience, but the awareness of it. Not the story, but the consciousness that witnesses stories. Not the constructed identity, but the raw fact of being alive, of being present, of being. This is what mystics mean by enlightenment, what Buddhists call no self, what psychologists are beginning to recognize as a shift in the locus of identity from the default mode network's narrative self to what neuroscientists call bare awareness or consciousness itself. But let me be absolutely clear about something. This is not blissful, not immediately. The initial experience of ego death is not peace, it's emptiness. It's the void. It's the terrifying recognition that everything you thought was solid is actually hollow, that the self you've defended so fiercely is, and always has been, a phantom. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes this moment as the greatest opportunity and the greatest danger. If the person can recognize the void as their true nature, they achieve liberation. If they panic and try to reconstitute the ego, they remain trapped in the cycle of suffering. Everything depends on what happens in this liminal space between the death of the old self and the potential birth of something new. Some people describe this moment as falling through the floor of their reality and discovering there's infinite space underneath. Others describe it as watching their entire identity revealed as a mask, and then watching the mask dissolve, leaving... what? No face underneath. Just seeing. Just awareness. Just this. For some, this realization brings immediate relief. The inner voices don't disappear, but they're no longer you. They're just thoughts, phenomena arising in consciousness. You're not the anxious voice. You're the awareness that notices anxiety. You're not the critic. You're the space in which self-criticism appears and passes. The war ends not because anyone won, but because you've discovered you were never really a combatant. You were the arena in which the battle took place. But for others, this realization brings even deeper terror. Because if you're not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the body, not the memories, not the identity, then what are you? And more frightening, are you anything at all? This is the edge of the abyss that philosophers have called existential nihilism. the recognition that there is no inherent meaning, no absolute purpose, no solid ground anywhere, that we are conscious animals evolved on a random planet in an indifferent universe, briefly aware of our own existence before we cease to exist, that all the structures of meaning we create, religion, philosophy, morality, love, purpose, are precisely that, created, not discovered, not objective, not real in any absolute sense. If this realization stops here, it can lead to profound despair. What Nietzsche feared as the ultimate consequence of the death of God, the collapse of all values, all meaning, all motivation. Why do anything? Why care about anything? Why continue existing at all if existence is fundamentally meaningless? But here's where something extraordinary can happen, where the descent can become awakening, where nihilism can transform into what some philosophers call existential freedom. Because if there is no inherent meaning, then you are free to create meaning. If there are no absolute values, then you choose your values. If the self is not a fixed entity, but a process of becoming, then you are not trapped in any particular version of yourself. You are not condemned to remain who you've been. The death of the false self creates space for authentic self-creation. This is what existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir understood. We are condemned to be free. The absence of given meaning is not a tragedy, but a liberation. We are not puppets of fate, not predetermined by genetics or history or divine plan. We are creative agents capable of authoring our own existence. But this freedom is terrifying, because it means we are responsible. We cannot blame our unhappiness on our circumstances, our past, our nature. We cannot hide behind, "That's just who I am." If the self is constructed, then we are the constructors. If meaning is created, then we are the creators. And if we don't like our life, if we're suffering, if we're unfulfilled, if we're living inauthentically, we have no one to blame but ourselves. This is why most people avoid this realization at all costs, why they cling to predetermined identity, to given meaning, to the comfort of external authority telling them who to be and how to live. Freedom is burden. Responsibility is overwhelming. It's easier to believe we're trapped, that we have no choice, that we are fixed entities in a determined universe. But when the inner collapse happens, when the structure of the false self crumbles, whether we want it to or not, we don't have the luxury of avoiding this truth anymore. We are forced to confront the raw fact of our freedom. And we must choose, remain in the void, paralyzed by meaninglessness, or begin the creative act of constructing authentic meaning from the ground up. Carl Jung called this process individuation, not becoming a unique individual in the sense of different from others, but becoming individuated from the collective, no longer living according to inherited scripts, external expectations, or unconscious patterns. Instead, taking full ownership of your psychological reality and consciously integrating all the disparate parts of the psyche into a coherent whole that is true to your essential nature. But here's the paradox Jung discovered. You cannot will yourself to individuate. You cannot force transformation through effort. The ego, the conscious I, cannot transform itself, because it is itself the problem. The entity trying to change is the very structure that needs to change. It's like trying to lift yourself by your own bootstraps. It's logically impossible. So transformation requires something different, cooperation with forces larger than the ego. Jung called these forces the self, with a capital S, meaning the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, both personal and archetypal. The self contains the blueprint for who you might become if you could get out of your own way. And individuation is not the ego transforming itself, but the ego learning to serve the self rather than oppose it. This sounds mystical, and in a sense it is, but it's also describing a real psychological process that happens when we stop trying to control our own transformation and instead allow it to unfold according to its own intelligence. Think of it like healing from a physical wound. You don't heal yourself through effort. You can't will the cells to regenerate. What you can do is create conditions that allow healing to happen. Clean the wound, rest, provide nutrition, remove obstacles. The body has its own wisdom for healing. Your conscious role is to support that process, not direct it. The same is true psychologically. You cannot think your way out of ego death, cannot strategize your way through the collapse, cannot use willpower to reconstruct yourself. What you can do is create conditions that allow the psyche's natural transformative process to complete. Find support, maintain physical health, create space and time for the process, remove obstacles like addiction or abusive relationships, and most importantly, surrender the illusion of control. This surrender is not passive. It's not giving up. It's radically different. It's active cooperation with something happening inside you that is wiser than your conscious intentions. It's trusting, even when you can't see where it's going, that the collapse is not random chaos but directed evolution, that the psyche is not attacking you but trying to free you. In spiritual traditions, this is what's meant by grace, not divine intervention from outside, but the inherent wisdom of consciousness itself, guiding its own transformation. The Eastern concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, flowing with the Tao rather than against it. Christian mystics called it letting go and letting God, recognizing that the small self cannot save itself, but must surrender to something larger. Modern psychology is beginning to understand this process in neurobiological terms. Research on neuroplasticity shows that the brain is constantly reorganizing itself based on experience. Trauma can create rigid neural patterns, loops of fear and defense that become increasingly entrenched. But under certain conditions, safety, support, novel experience, the brain can reorganize those patterns. Old neural pathways can weaken, new connections can form, the very structure of consciousness can change. And here's what's fascinating. The conditions that promote this positive neuroplasticity are strikingly similar to what spiritual traditions have recommended for transformation. Meditation, which reduces activity in the default mode network and increases cognitive flexibility. Contemplative practice, which creates space between stimulus and response, allowing new choices. Community support, which provides safety and co-regulation, allowing the nervous system to down-regulate from chronic stress. Meaning-making, which recruits higher cortical functions to reorganize traumatic material into coherent narrative. What ancient wisdom discovered through centuries of practice, modern neuroscience is validating through research. Consciousness can transform itself, but not through force, through allowing, through creating conditions, through surrender to the process. So what does this look like practically? When someone is in the midst of ego death, of psychological collapse, of the inner war, what actually helps? First, context and framework. Understanding what's happening, knowing that others have survived this, having language for the experience that doesn't pathologize it. This is why traditional cultures had initiation rites, why religious traditions had mystical literature, why wisdom teachings described the stages of the spiritual path, so that when someone entered the dark territory, they knew they were on a journey, not losing their mind. They had maps, imperfect but helpful, for navigating the landscape. Second, community and support, not fixing or rescuing, but witnessing, holding space for the process without trying to make it stop. This is incredibly difficult in practice because watching someone suffer triggers our own discomfort and desire to alleviate pain. But sometimes the most loving thing we can do is simply stay present with someone in their hell without trying to pull them out prematurely. Third, practices that maintain basic functioning. This is prosaic but essential. When the internal world is chaos, external structure provides an anchor. Simple routines, sleeping, eating, moving the body, maintaining hygiene. These become acts of profound importance when the self is dissolving. They provide continuity when everything else is discontinuous. Fourth, patience. This process cannot be rushed. The psyche has its own timeline. Some people move through ego death in weeks, others take years. There is no right pace. Trying to force completion only creates resistance and prolongs suffering. Fifth, meaning-making. Even in the midst of collapse, finding ways to frame the experience that honor its difficulty while maintaining hope. Journaling, creating art, talking about what's happening, weaving the chaos into narrative, even if that narrative has to be rewritten repeatedly. And finally, surrender. This is both the first step and the last, the hardest and the most essential. Letting go of who you thought you were, releasing the need to control the process, accepting that you cannot go back to the innocence you had before the collapse began, trusting that what emerges on the other side, whoever you become, will be more real than who you were. When these conditions align, something remarkable happens, not all at once, not with fireworks and enlightenment, but gradually, subtly, a new way of being begins to emerge. You notice you can watch your thoughts without believing them. You experience emotion without being consumed by it. You have preferences and opinions, but you're not attached to them. You engage fully with life, but with a quality of lightness, of play, that wasn't there before. You take things seriously, but not personally. You discover that the self you're constructing now is different from the one that collapsed. It's more flexible, more transparent to itself, more willing to change. You hold your identity lightly. You're comfortable with uncertainty. You don't need to know who you are in any fixed sense because you understand that who you are is always becoming. The inner voices are still there. The critic still criticizes. The anxious voice still warns. The perfectionist still pushes, but you're not fighting them anymore. You're not identified with them. They're just part of the Parliament of Selves, and you've stopped needing one of them to be the tyrant. There's a more mature governance now, not dictatorship, but democracy, where all parts have a voice but none dominate completely. You relate to other people differently, less defended, more authentic, willing to be seen without the armor of the false self. This creates deeper connection, but also more vulnerability. You can be hurt more easily because you're not protected by the elaborate defenses you once maintained, but you're also alive more fully, present more completely, capable of love and joy and creativity in ways that weren't accessible when you were busy maintaining an image. This is what's on the other side of ego death. Not perfection, not perpetual bliss, not freedom from all suffering, but a different relationship to suffering, a more authentic inhabiting of your own life, a sense that you've died and been reborn not as someone else, but as a truer version of yourself. Some people emerge from this process with clear purpose. They know what they're meant to do, who they're meant to serve, how they want to live. The collapse burned away everything inessential, leaving only what matters most. Others emerge with more questions than answers, but they're comfortable with that now. They don't need certainty. They're willing to live in the questions, to exist in the tension of not knowing, to embrace mystery, and some emerge changed in ways they can't articulate. They just know that something fundamental has shifted, that they see the world differently, that they experience themselves differently, that they've touched something in the depths of their own collapse that revealed both the groundlessness of existence and the freedom that groundlessness provides. This is the paradox at the heart of the awakening. You had to lose yourself to find yourself. But the self you found is not a thing. It's not a fixed identity. It's closer to a process, a capacity, a quality of awareness that was always present but obscured by the constructed identity you thought you were. The ancient Greek aphorism carved into the Temple of Delphi said, "Know thyself." But perhaps the deeper wisdom is recognizing that there is no fixed self to know, only consciousness, experiencing itself moment by moment, creating and recreating its own form in an endless dance of becoming. When you realize this, not intellectually, but through direct experience of your own dissolution and reconstruction, you've touched what various traditions call enlightenment, awakening, salvation, liberation, or simply freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of a fixed identity. Freedom from the need to defend and maintain a false self. Freedom to be present with reality as it is, rather than as you wish it to be. Freedom to suffer when suffering comes and to let it go when it passes. Freedom to love without attachment, to engage without clinging, to live fully while holding it all lightly. This doesn't mean the struggle is over. Evolution doesn't end. You don't reach some final state and remain there forever. Consciousness continues to transform. New layers of ego form and must eventually be released. The process that Jung called individuation is not something you complete. It's something you live for as long as you're alive. But something has fundamentally changed. You know now, from direct experience, that you can survive the death of yourself, that the you that seemed so solid was always transparent. That transformation is not something to fear, but to trust. That when the inner world turns against you, it might actually be turning toward truth. And this knowledge, this embodied experiential knowledge, changes how you move through life. You're no longer as afraid, not because bad things can't happen, but because you know that even the worst psychological suffering, even ego death itself, can be doorway rather than dead end, can be birth rather than only death, can be awakening rather than only collapse. This is the gift hidden in the darkest experience a human being can endure, the treasure buried in the depths of psychological hell, the secret that mystics have whispered for centuries, but that each person must discover for themselves. You are not who you think you are. You are so much more. And the only way to discover that is to lose everything you thought defined you and see what remains when the story finally falls away. We've traveled tonight into territory that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We've explored the mechanism by which consciousness turns on itself, the process through which the self we've constructed becomes our greatest adversary, the dark night of the soul, the ego death, the psychological collapse that looks like madness, but might be the mind's most sophisticated technology for transformation. If you've listened this far, you're likely one of three people, someone who has been through this fire and emerged changed. If that's you, perhaps tonight provided language for something you've experienced but couldn't name, validation that you weren't losing your mind but transforming it, confirmation that the suffering you endured served a purpose beyond mere survival, someone who is in the midst of this process right now. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. What you're experiencing is real. It's terrifying. It's legitimate suffering that deserves compassion and support. But it is not permanent. Others have walked this path before you and found their way through. The self that feels like it's dying probably needed to die. And you, the awareness reading these words, the consciousness experiencing this moment, you will survive. Not unchanged, but present. Still here, still capable of experiencing, of feeling, of being alive, or someone who fears this might happen to them, someone who feels the cracks beginning to form in their carefully constructed identity. If that's you, know this. You cannot prevent transformation through vigilance. You cannot protect yourself from growth through control. The collapse, if it comes, will come, but you can prepare by understanding its nature, by finding support systems now, by learning to distinguish between pathology requiring intervention and transformation requiring patience, by cultivating the capacity to surrender before resistance makes the process more painful than necessary. Throughout human history, across cultures and centuries, our species has generated wisdom about this process. The shamanic initiation where the healer is torn apart by spirits, the mystical dark night where God seems absent, the Buddhist recognition of no self, the psychological understanding of ego death, the neuroscientific discovery that the self is constructed and can be reconstructed, all pointing to the same phenomenon, Consciousness has the capacity to transform itself by dissolving its own structures. We live in an age that pathologizes this process, that medicates away symptoms that might be signaling necessary transformation, that treats all psychological distress as dysfunction requiring correction. And yet we also live in an age of unprecedented mental health crisis, of epidemic levels of depression, anxiety, and meaning crisis, of people who are functional but not truly alive, who maintain their psychological structure but have lost touch with authentic existence. Perhaps these two phenomena are related. Perhaps by suppressing the process of ego death, we prevent the very transformation that could lead to authentic living. Perhaps in our rush to eliminate suffering, we've eliminated the possibility of the kind of suffering that transforms. I'm not advocating for unnecessary pain, not romanticizing psychological crisis, not suggesting we should induce ego death or withhold treatment from those who need it. But I am suggesting that we need cultural wisdom about transformation. We need to distinguish between breakdown and breakthrough. We need support systems for those undergoing ego death. We need to recognize that some psychological crises are not illnesses, but initiations. The future of human consciousness might depend on our ability to collectively hold space for this process, to create contexts where people can safely undergo psychological transformation, to develop the wisdom to know when to intervene and when to support, to remember what traditional cultures knew, that death and rebirth are not metaphors, but accurate descriptions of how consciousness evolves. Because here's what I believe. We are in the midst of a collective crisis of consciousness. The old structures, religious, political, economic, psychological, are crumbling. The stories we've told ourselves about who we are as a species, what life means, how we should live, they're becoming unsustainable. We're facing, collectively, what individuals face during ego death, the collapse of certainty, the dissolution of identity, the terror of groundlessness, and we have a choice. We can resist, grip tighter to failing structures, fight to preserve what's dying, or we can learn from those who've survived personal ego death, that the way through is surrender, that the death of the old is necessary for the birth of the new. That transformation requires us to lose everything we thought was stable so we can discover what's actually real. The inner world turns against you, not to destroy you, but to free you. The war within is not evidence of failure, but invitation to transformation. And when you finally surrender, when you let the false self die, you discover that you were never really in danger. You were always already the consciousness within which all these dramas play out, indestructible, eternal, free. This is the awakening that waits on the other side of collapse, not as a reward for suffering, but as the recognition that was always available but hidden by the noise of the constructed self. You are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your history or your hopes or your identity. You are the awareness within which all of that arises and passes, and that awareness cannot be threatened, cannot be destroyed, cannot be lost. When the inner world turns against you, it's actually the universe turning toward itself, consciousness recognizing its own nature through the very crisis that seemed to threaten it. The collapse is the awakening. The death is the birth. The war ends not with victory, but with the recognition that there was never really an enemy, only consciousness, playing all the parts, staging its own transformation. And you, whoever you are, whatever you're experiencing, wherever you are on this journey, you are that consciousness, not separate from it, not witnessing it from outside. You are it, experiencing itself, transforming itself, awakening itself, through the magnificent, terrible, sacred process of being human. The inner world turns against you, and in turning, it reveals the truth that was hidden all along. There is no inner and outer, no self and other, no fixed identity to defend or lose. Only this, only awareness, only consciousness, endlessly becoming. And that recognition, that direct embodied realization, is worth every moment of the suffering it takes to reach it. Welcome to the other side of ego death. Welcome to the beginning of authentic existence. Welcome to the awakening that looks like collapse, the birth that feels like death, the freedom that requires the surrender of everything you thought you were. Welcome home. If you found this exploration valuable, take a moment to sit in silence. Let the concept settle. Notice what arises in your own consciousness, and remember, transformation is not something you achieve, it's something you allow. The awakening is already happening. The only question is whether you're fighting it or flowing with it.